And just like that, week 3 of the fantasy season is here. So you know what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, talk about every single wide receiver, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting in week 3 of the fantasy season. Let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. We're going to have the Dolphins traveling to face the Bills on a short week, and definitely an interesting mix of wide receivers for both teams here. Let's start with the Dolphins. Tyreek Hill, we left as a flex option this past week. Came through for you guys with 16.9 fantasy points, 7 targets, 6 catches, 109 receiving yards for Hill on the week. And while the Dolphins, still lost in week 2, from a fantasy perspective, they did look much improved. And Hill is still the leading wide receiver on this team in terms of targets and total receiving yards. But I was a little, I was out on Jalen Waddle this past week, but he came through, scored a touchdown, had 5 catches for 68 receiving yards and 17.8 fantasy points. So we do kind of have a mixed bag in terms of the Bills defense to start this season. But ultimately, this isn't really a secondary that worries me, but it is a short week here. I mean, the Bills went from being very poor against wide receivers in week 1 to being very, very good in week 2 between the Ravens and the Jets. So I don't want to say I'm necessarily completely worried, but the short week and the fact that they played much better against the position and that they are at home has me worried for Hill and Waddle. Plus the woes of this entire team still has me worried. So I think they're both in the flex area. Don't get me wrong, but Thursday Night Football, not always my favorite, so I'm not going to call them anything more than a flex. And then, in kind of interesting fashion here, we also saw the Bills wide receivers play well in week 1 and have lots of fantasy value across the board, to in week 2 having all 3 primary wide receivers on this team have 6.7 or less fantasy points in week 2. But I do think that this matchup against the Dolphins won't be so one-sided. Like the Jets didn't even show up this past week. Short week, once again, maybe the defenses pop up. I really hate Thursday Night Football from a fantasy perspective, but I think Keon Coleman, Khalil Shakir can still be in the flex category going into the week, but we definitely have to bump them down after they gave us a big nod of confidence in week 1 as startable fantasy options. There'll be nothing more than a flex for me here in week 3 of the season. Moving into Sunday's action with the early slate of games, we'll have the Bengals traveling to face the Vikings. And what exactly are we going to make of this Bengals wide receiver room with no Joe Burrow for essentially the entire fantasy season for the 2025 year? Very, very disheartening. But how disheartening, because Jamar Chase had 36.5 fantasy points this past week, and T. Higgins had 14.6. We have seen Jake Browning support these wide receivers with the absence of Joe Burrow in the past as well. So I'm not really overly concerned yet. I mean, this is a good enough matchup against the Minnesota Vikings, who play much better against wide receivers in week 2 than they did in week 1. But I'm still going to call Jamar Chase a start here in week 3. And I'll go ahead and say with confidence, just don't overthink this one. He's still going to be force-fed. Jake Browning's got a little Jameis Winston in him. I mean, he might throw 3 interceptions, but still threw for 240 passing yards and 2 touchdowns this past weekend, ran for a touchdown. So I like Jamar Chase, and I think T. Higgins is still fine as a flex option. I'm more worried about Higgins than Chase with no Burrow, but still, as long as these guys are producing, they're going to have to be week in, week out starters for you guys. And I would not be overreacting necessarily, although it is a knock to both of their fantasy values as we start to progress through the season, unfortunately. Then moving along to the Vikings. I mean, I got Justin Jefferson as a start. He's had 11.1 or more fantasy points in each of the first 2 games of the season. Good matchup for him against the Bengals. If it was a tougher matchup, I would still have Justin Jefferson as a start, but maybe I would feel more nervous. But yeah, I mean, this matchup against the Bengals is completely fine. And ultimately, in terms of what's making me nervous is obviously the quarterback play that we've seen out of J.J. McCarthy. Was able to bring the Vikings back in week 1, put together some good drives and everything. But he still has yet to throw for more than 158 passing yards in a game and has 3 interceptions and 3 fumbles through the first 2 games of the season. So not feeling extremely bullish about this offense, especially after week 2 where it just looked absolutely anemic across the board. And really, I thought Adam Thielen could have, a nice opportunity in the absence of Jordan Addison, and maybe he does against the Bengals defense this week. But, I'm just not even considering any other Vikings wide receiver and really any other Vikings player as a full-on must start in any time soon in the season. But, Justin Jefferson, the ceiling is lowered. Like, he missed a lot of training camp, and the chemistry just isn't really there for McCarthy and JJ, as they didn't get to go through training camp in the, preseason together. So, I don't know if his ceiling's incredibly high right now, but the matchup is still good enough that JJ is still going to be a start for me here in week 3. As a matter of fact, I feel very confident in the fact that Ja'Marr Chase is going to be force-fed the football this week. So I will head straight to Underdog to take the over on Ja'Marr Chase to score a touchdown in week 3 of the season. Don't forget, guys, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH are getting a free NFL Pick'em to use towards NFL week 3 action. Take that free Pick'em, pair it with Ja'Marr Chase to score a touchdown in week 3, and if both of those lines hit, you will automatically double your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog has a brand new offer exclusive to all users who sign up using promo code THECATCH on Underdog. Once you play through $5, you'll automatically receive $50 in bonus cash to use towards week 3 NFL action. And on top of that, you'll also receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up using promo code THECATCH. If you guys want to take advantage of all of Underdog's week 3 exclusive NFL offers, make sure you sign up using that promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. Going along, we have the Texans traveling to face the Jaguars. As a reminder, I do have to record these before Monday Night Football has been played. So if anything happens crazy with the Texans wide receivers, I'll have a pinned comment down below. But ultimately, I'm probably just going to be looking to start Nico Collins and not anybody else. We got Jaden Higgins, Jalen Noel, the next man up, with Christian Kirk still set to miss time. Maybe he's ready for week 3, maybe he's not, but I wouldn't want to start him fresh off of injury. And I will mention, the Jaguars defense has been surprisingly okay this year, but they have struggled against the wide receiver position, finishing bottom 5 against the position in fantasy points allowed. So Nico, really regardless of what happens in week 2, I'm not going to try and overreact here through the first 2 weeks of the season. I think he is still a strong start in week 3. I'll let you guys know if Monday Night Football really changes that perspective. But I know the Texans struggled through the air week 1. Nico had a bad week. We'll see how things turn out. Ultimately, probably still going to be a start for me. Then we move along to the Jaguars, talking about struggling wide receivers. I have Brian Thomas and Travis Hunter as flex options, and maybe that's not fair to Dewami Brown, who I have as a sit. But I mean, right now, I kind of just want to sit all of these wide receivers, I was very close to putting everyone here as a sit. And, the Texans defense, once again, Monday Night Football has been played, so it's kind of tough to read this. They struggled against wide receivers in week 1. So I think there's some sort of opportunity here as the Buccaneers had success against them in week 1. But as long as Derek Stingley's healthy, I mean, he does have the ability to shut down a number 1 wide receiver. And now we have the news that Brian Thomas Jr. is dealing with a wrist injury. Had some drops in week 2. A lot of the chemistry between T-Law and Brian Thomas feels really bad, and got him giving up on plays. He doesn't want to get hit, looking at hospital balls, turning into interceptions. 12 targets in week 2, 4 catches. 7 targets in week 1, 1 catch. Something is a bit off here, to say the least, for a player who finished as a wide receiver 4 last year in PPR. So I'm not going to give up on Brian Thomas just yet, but maybe he gets moved down a bit and is more of definitely a low-end wide receiver too, if not a flex option for you guys. So we'll also have to see, he's been playing through a wrist injury. Does that change his status for week 3? I'm going to leave them as flexes. I don't want to feed off of 1 week for Dewami Brown, but maybe he starts to get more opportunity, and Parker Washington got more opportunity this past week too, and also had 12.6 fantasy points. So this is a bad situation early in the season. Nothing to be overly panicked about for sure, because it's very early in the season. But once again, I just don't want to react too much just yet. But yeah, B-Tom, Travis Hunter, low-end flexes. And I mean, Travis Hunter, another player here who's not really doing a lot with the opportunity he's being given. So I'm probably avoiding all Jaguars wide receivers in week 3 unless we get a better pattern that starts to emerge. Next up, we got the Colts traveling to face the Titans. Let's start with the Colts side of things. Revamped offense here with Danny Dimes slinging it at quarterback. This is a good matchup for them against the Titans. They are bottom 5 against the wide receiver position on the season. They just got basically shredded up and down by Devontae Adams and Puka Nacua this past week. Really shredded. They played okay in week 1, but I like this spot for the Colts wide receivers. I'm not surprised. Like, we had Pittman as a sit last week because of the potential Pat Surtain shadow. Like, not really surprising to see him have a worse week 2 than a worse week 1. Josh Downs, had the advantage this past week, playing out of the slot and getting a little bit more involvement. 11.1 fantasy points for him in week 2, 8 for Pittman this past week. So I think both these guys are flexible. It is a good matchup. I think this matchup actually benefits Pittman more than Downs at the end of the day. So we'll have to see how things kind of shake out. And Alec Pierce is a player who in desperation territory can always be considered, but you just never know what you're going to get. So the good thing is the Colts are throwing the football more with success, even against a defense like the Broncos. So you can definitely feel good about these guys as flex options against the Titans in week 3. And I got Calvin Ridley and Alec Manor, both as potential flex options, but they are like lower end flex options. I like the potential in Manor. He did have 7 targets in week 1, 6 targets, a touchdown this past week, 15.6 fantasy points. We talked about him in the waiver video. Calvin Ridley is looking like a very low ceiling player right now. And Cam Ward is not playing like awful, but he's not really playing in a manner that is going to really benefit fantasy by any stretch. So the scramble play that led to the touchdown to Manor was encouraging to see, especially against a pretty good Rams defense, although they didn't play as well this past week. But that's another thing. Like, this Colts defense is not that bad. They have been pretty good through the first 2 weeks of the season, but kind of middle of the pack against wide receivers. So Ridley, a low-end flex. He hasn't scored more than 8.7 fantasy points on the season. Manor, a risky flex. So, like, they're not in the same category of flex as like a Pittman or Downs, for example, or even some of the other players we've gone over in the video. But, I know a lot of you guys out there are not just in 10 or 12-man leagues or single flex leagues. We got people who watch these videos, you play Dynasty or in 14-man leagues, 3 wide receiver leagues. Like, we see a lot. So it's going to depend on who's on your roster and everything. But I think they're at least flexible here in week 3. Next up, we have the Raiders traveling to face the Commanders. Let's start the Raiders side of things. And I am recording this before Monday Night Football, so if any injuries, any crazy performances happen, I'll have a pinned comment down below. But as long as Jacoby Myers is healthy, I think he's a solid start. Good wide receiver 2 for you guys. The Commanders have been quietly very good against wide receivers through the first 2 weeks of the season, but I played the Giants and then the Packers. Like, Jaden Reed got hurt. Giants did nothing week 1, so I don't want to read too much into that necessarily. But regardless, Myers, good start, good floor, had a good ceiling in week 1. As long as he's healthy, I'm good with Myers in week 3. And we'll just kind of sit back and watch the Raiders wide receiver room. And I don't know if there's going to be anything enough that emerges going into this matchup from Monday Night Football that Tucker or Thornton or Jack Bash are going to be relevant. But like I said, if my mind changes, there'll be a pinned comment down below. For the Commanders, I'm going to say Debo is in the start category. He has 17.4 or more fantasy points through the first 2 weeks of the season, bumping him up from a flex option to just being a good start until further notice. 8 or more targets in each of the first 2 games for him on the season. And I'm leaving Scary Terry in the flex area, probably still a okay wide receiver 2 for you guys. I'm not going to panic on McLaurin. The Packers defense has been really good. He wasn't really necessary in week 1. And then, he's coming off of not really being in training camp or anything. So I think things will start to get going for McLaurin. I'm not in like a panic level yet with him, but I am maybe a little bit concerned he still spent relatively high draft capital on him, and Debo is, playing very well, and Zach Ertz is getting a lot of volume, but Austin Eckler goes down. That'll open up some more volume in the passing game for guys like Terry and Debo and Ertz, but also Jaden Daniels, his status for the week is uncertain as he's dealing with that knee injury, had an MRI. We don't really know what's going on there. Maybe that impacts the potential upside if Mariota or Josh Johnson's the starting quarterback. I would assume it'd be Marcus Mariota. But still, I think Debo startable. McLaurin probably a flex option. They get the Raiders. Don't really know how to read this defense quite yet this early in the season, but we'll see what happens here in week 3. Next up, we have the Rams traveling to face the Eagles in what should be a good matchup. Let's start with the Rams side of things. Puka Nacua, you are starting every single week, no matter what. 27.6 fantasy points in week 2. 9 targets, 8 grabs, 91 receiving yards. Nothing to see here. As long as Puka's healthy, Stafford's healthy, and maybe even if Stafford's not healthy, we're starting Puka Nacua. It's a tough matchup against the Eagles defense, don't get me wrong, but you got to start Puka Nacua in what should be a good competitive game overall. Devontae Adams, I was close to kind of putting in the flex area, but ultimately, I just think he should be a start. Like, you spent high enough draft capital on him. He's probably your wide receiver too. Just take what you get each and every week, roll with the punches. But this past week, you definitely felt good. 22.6 fantasy points, 13 targets, 6 catches, 106 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So the volume's been there. And if you guys watch the game, Stafford was targeting Adams a ton in the red zone, which is what we want to see as Devontae Adams owners, right? And, the volume was still good enough in week 1 as well. So if you own Adams, I think he's just in the start category. Maybe it'll be some fluctuation, but that happens with a lot of elite wide receivers. So very solid start, and one should be a very good matchup in terms of game script, if nothing else. Then we look to the Eagles wide receivers. I put a lot of confidence in A.J. Brown going into week 2. And I felt like this was a good matchup based on what we saw the Chiefs secondary do in week 1, giving up a ton of volume to Keenan Allen, Quinn Johnston, and Ladd McConkey, and it just wasn't there. Spags is a great defensive coordinator. It wasn't there in the Super Bowl, but this is, completely new season. But he's able to shut down these wide receivers and both A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith for the most part. And so far, we haven't seen either player score more than 9.3 fantasy points on the season. Devonta Smith, got a little banged up, but he was fine, able to play. Doesn't look like he's on the injury report. A.J. Brown not on the injury report. Some people speculating he's dealing with a hamstring injury or something still stemming from the offseason. But once again, he's still at 8 targets in week 2. Devonta had 6 targets. So I still think they're flex options. But yeah, you got to be a little bit concerned or at least frustrated. Hurts only threw for 101 passing yards in week 2, only 152 in week 1. We saw some of this last year at times. It is a run-first system. But whenever you bench these guys, they're going to pop off, right? So I'm not giving up on either Brown or Smith at this point in the season. Certainly, I think they're both very good buy low candidates. But once again, you're going to have to roll with the punches here. There is fluctuation even when it comes to kind of, star-studded wide receivers as well. So not giving up here. Also not feeling great. But both these guys should be strong flex options here in week 3. Next up, we got the Falcons traveling to face the Panthers. Let's start with the Falcons side of things. Don't know why I was talking weird. But anyways, what do we do with this Falcons wide receiver room? Michael Penix doing a whole lot of nothing in week 2. No quarterbacks doing anything in week 2 in that matchup. But only 3 for under 35 passing yards, and that was it. Nothing else to report. Lundo at 5.9 fantasy points. He did lead the team in, receiving for what it's worth with 49 receiving yards. I felt like maybe Darnell Mooney could come in here and have some sort of presence, but he had 20 receiving yards, which, I guess was okay based on what happened. I think that's the 3rd most receiving yards on the team. No, 4th most, including Kyle Pitts and Bijan. So, listen, they get the Panthers this week. It's a better matchup. I'm hoping Michael Penix can kind of bounce back here. But, actually, now that I look at it, the Panthers is not a good matchup, believe it or not. They've allowed the 2nd fewest fantasy points to wide receivers on the season, which is absolutely bizarre to me, but they haven't necessarily faced the stiffest of competition either. So I'm going to leave Drake London in the start category. Sorry, this has gotten very convoluted very quickly, but yeah, I'm not going to give up on Drake London just yet. And ultimately, he's the only Falcons receiver I would have any confidence in going into week 3. Then we look to the Panther side of things. T-Mac, a bit better for week 2. Told you guys going into week 2, like the volume was very good in week 1. A lot of things to be encouraged about. He had 10 targets, 6 catches, 100 receiving yards in week 2, 16 fantasy points. I think T-Mac is a very solid start going into the week. And the Falcons have been surprisingly pretty good against wide receivers. Worse in week 1 than in week 2. So I don't want to read too much into the ranking right now because J.J. McCarthy and the Vikings looked awful in week 2. But, this is a solid start area for T-Mac. Should give you a safe floor. I'd like to see him get in the end zone. Maybe that'll happen soon, but I don't know. With Hunter Renfrow hanging around, who had 2 touchdowns this past week, tough to say. Now, I don't want to completely overreact to Renfrow here, who had 23.8 fantasy points in week 2 and scored 2 touchdowns. But, I think he's flexible this week and will be added across, leagues on the waiver wire because Xavier Legette has been awful. One of the worst statistically performing wide receivers through the first 2 weeks of the season. And there's nobody else here in terms of wide receivers. Like Jatavion Sanders starting to get some work. He could be an option at tight end. Chuba Hubbard gets some work in terms of a receiving back, but there's no other wide receivers. And Dave Canales, the head coach, loves to use a slot wide receiver in his offense. And they were expecting it to be Jalen Coker, but he's on IR, and they let Adam Thielen go. So they had to, elevate Renfrow from the practice squad or sign him from the practice squad, and he didn't do anything in week 1, which makes me a little bit nervous, but he did have 6 targets in week 1 and then looked very good in week 2 against what I would argue is a decent Cardinals defense. So I think Renfrow is flexible this week, but don't get too crazy with it. It depends on who else is on your roster. But yeah, just not a lot of production, if any, at the wide receiver position outside of these 2 guys. So I think they are both startable, and T-Mac definitely a solid start here in week 3. Moving along, we got the Steelers traveling to face the Patriots. Let's start with the Steelers side of things. DK Metcalf, this was my worry with him going into the year. Like, he will have production, but what will the real ceiling be? And, he's startable. He's still a start for me. But, he scored this past week, only had 3 catches and only had 11 fantasy points. Previous week, 4 catches, 12.3 fantasy points. So this is a great matchup for him. The Patriots have been very poor, bottom 5 against opposing wide receivers and fantasy points allowed on the season. So fire him up. You're probably going to have to start him anyways, based on draft capital and everything. So I think he's a solid start this week. And I will admit, maybe I got a little bit fooled on the Calvin Austin performance from week 1. This is a good spot for him. If you picked him up off waivers, you're still kind of hanging on to him. You're in a bad spot in your flex area. Maybe in deeper formats, Calvin Austin can bounce back this week. But yeah, I was a little bit fooled by the week 1 performance. But Calvin Austin was also a guy that I thought had some potential going into the year because this team needs a true number 2 wide receiver. And he still is the number 2 wide receiver. But that doesn't say a lot about this offense. And when you look at the roster with Roman Wilson, the next man up, and then the 2 tight ends and Freiermuth and Johnny Smith, and I guess Jalen Warren, a running back. But, I think Calvin Austin is just going to be way too difficult to trust. So I'm going to leave him as a sit. But I don't think you necessarily need to drop Calvin Austin. But then again, when are you actually going to have the confidence to start him? Like I said, this is a good matchup. Maybe he bounces back this week. Moving to the Patriots. Stephon Diggs, Kayshon Boutte, maybe Demario Douglas. I don't know. On a week-to-week basis, I think Kayshon Boutte maybe has the most upside in the floor play is Diggs. We saw receiving work out of Ramondre Stevenson this past week. Slight receiving work out of Henderson with just 2 catches. Hunter Henry disappeared this past week with just 1 catch. This is a really interesting offense because They went from Drake May throwing the football 46 times in week 1 to just 23 times this past week. It was a weird game script against the Dolphins and like a back and forth game, special teams scoring. I don't know. But, we look at the Steelers defense. They haven't been great. Bottom 12 against wide receivers going into week 3, fantasy points allowed. So I think Diggs still flexible, although he disappointed with 7.2 fantasy points this past week. And I would argue Booty also disappointed. He only had 1 catch. It just went for a touchdown. 8.6 fantasy points for him. But yeah, low-end flexes, good enough matchup. Nothing else there for me. I do think that the Patriots will probably throw the football more in week 3 than they did in week 2, but not a ton of upside with these Patriots wide receivers as we approach the week. Next up, we got the Packers traveling to face the Browns. Let's start with the Packers wide receivers room, which I think some people are going to get a little bit excited about. Maybe not excited, but antsy about, because Jaden Reed, is going to miss the next 6 to 8 weeks with that broken collarbone. And there is opportunity here across the board, whether you want to talk about Matthew Golden, Romeo Doubs, or Dontavion Wicks. I think Doubs and Wicks will probably increase in roster percentage as they're both pretty lowly rostered. And I don't want people to get too excited about Matthew Golden just yet, because there are some people in the boat of like, no Jaden Reed, time to fire up Matthew Golden, but he only has 4 targets through the first 2 games of the season, and this is a good Browns defense that has not just been playing well in terms of their front 7 and against the running back position, but they've at least played decent against opposing wide receivers, although they basically got shredded this past week by every wide receiver on the Ravens. They're still finishing middle of the pack in terms of fantasy points allowed to the position, and they played pretty dang well against Jamar Chase and T. Higgins in week 1. So I just don't love this matchup, but I could see this Browns defense playing better against Josh Jacobs in the running game and forcing the Packers to throw the football a bit here. So I don't know what that means. And once again, there's opportunity for every Packers wide receiver here. But you guys know this is easily the most frustrating wide receiver room when it comes to fantasy football. So I'm just going to stay away this week. I mean, what position are you in that you really need to start or even flex Golden or Doubs or Wicks? They should probably all be rostered. But here in week 3, I'm just not super excited about starting any of them. And they get Dallas next week on the road, which is a better matchup. But then they do have an early week 5 bye. So just bear that in mind if you guys go out chasing any of these Packers wide receivers. All right, then we got the Browns. So Judy, 9.1 fantasy points this past week. Cedric Tillman, who I liked a lot going into that matchup against the Ravens, just 10.2 fantasy points and basically just caught a ricochet touchdown, nothing crazy there. He did have 7 targets, but his 2 catches, these guys are just lacking a real ceiling. And it was a good matchup. The Ravens secondary is not fantastic. So we know that Joe Flacco is going to throw the football a ridiculous amount. He's thrown the football 45 times in each of the first 2 games of the season. So the opportunity is still there, but this is a good Packers defense. I'm pretty worried about them on a week-to-week basis, but they are kind of still middle of the pack against wide receivers on the season. So we know the Browns are going to throw a lot, and they're going to be forced to throw, I think, against this Packers defense. But this is a matchup that I do worry may get a little bit defensive when all things are said and done. So not a crazy high ceiling, but they are both certainly flexible. And yeah, I just don't want to try and figure out the puzzle of the Packers wide receivers room here in week 3. So there's sits for me as we approach the weekend. Next up, we'll have the Jets, who will travel to face the Buccaneers. And yes, I am recording this before Monday Night Football has been played. Please don't yell at me in the comments, but if there's any major injury or anything that sways my mind here, it'll be in a pinned comment down below in regards to the Bucs wide receivers. But let's start with Garrett Wilson. I will admit I was very, very high on Garrett Wilson going into week 2. I love the volume in week 1, love the target share, love the matchup based on week 1, and 9 fantasy points. That's all he had after having 22.5 in week 2. Justin Fields is in concussion protocol. Don't know his status for the week at the time of recording this. We might get Tyrod Taylor. I'm still leaving Garrett Wilson as a start. Maybe I'm just stubborn because I'm a Garrett Wilson guy or whatever. Tough to get a good read on the Buccaneers defense. I'm sorry. Without Monday Night Football haven't been played yet. They were not bad week 1 against Drake London, the Falcons. So I think of Taylor as a starter, Believe it or not, the upside's a little bit limited, even with a very bad performance out of Fields this past week. I still prefer Justin Fields. But yeah, you can't feel too great after last week. So startable, maybe one of the lower end players in the start category this week. So I gave him the asterisk, and maybe it depends on who the starting quarterback is, So some questions here, but I'm just going to leave Garrett Wilson as a start, and maybe it's because I'm stubborn. I don't know. But yeah, Josh Reynolds missed this past week. We don't need to talk about any other wide receiver on this team, but Josh Reynolds is a sit, and he didn't even play this past week. And I'm not even going to break down the other Jets wide receivers. Okay, in terms of the Buccaneers wide receivers, I'm probably going to feel good enough about both these guys going into week 3 that they can remain in your starting lineups, really regardless of what happens on Monday Night Football. We'll see with Derek Stingley on Mike Evans, how that looks, and then presumably he's going to have Sauce Gardner on him in week 3. That's probably good for Emeka Egbuka in both week 2 and week 3 here, but still, this is Mike Evans. This is still a player that you're going to be starting the majority of your starting lineups overall. So Evans, Egbuka, if anything crazy happens, I'll have a pinned comment down below, but ultimately I'm going to leave both these guys as starts as we approach week 3. Moving into the afternoon slate, we're going to have the Broncos traveling to face the Chargers, and this will be an interesting one. Once again, Monday Night Football has not been played, but that Chargers defense was kind of middle of the pack against the Chiefs in week 1. They allowed a big game to Hollywood Brown, so it'll be interesting to kind of see how we feel going into week 3. And we're coming off a game where Courtland Sutton did absolutely nothing, had just 1 catch against the Colts, and really the big name would be Troy Franklin, kind of stepping up as the wide receiver 2 for the Broncos, getting a lot of volume, 9 targets, 8 catches, 89 receiving yards, a touchdown, and 24 fantasy points. And then basically, we look in terms of the other Broncos wide receivers, like Marvin Mims did have a touchdown, but just 2 catches, and Pat Bryant non-existent, essentially with just 3 targets, 2 catches, 3.8 fantasy points. Mims only had 2 catches, but at least scored a touchdown. So kind of interesting. We are seeing this offense maybe opening up a little bit. Maybe that's hurting Courtland Sutton. I still think Sutton is a good start and a tough player to bench because I still believe in this offense, especially with Bo Nix coming off of a 3-touchdown game. So I have Troy Franklin as a sit because I don't want to overreact too much because there's going to be some fluctuation in terms of these Broncos wide receivers throughout the year and how they're utilized. But Troy Franklin, I do think, deserves to be rostered and is a very interesting player. But, first of all, he can't be more than a flex. And second of all, we don't want to overreact to just one performance in, what's the first 3 weeks of the season. So I'm going to leave Sutton as a start. I know it's frustrating with what he did last week and everything, but he did have some poor performances last year and still came out as a top 15 wide receiver in fantasy. So don't want to overreact. I still believe he's the true number 1 wide receiver for the Broncos. Moving to the Chargers wide receivers. Once again, maybe Monday Night Football changes my mind here, but Ladd, Keenan Allen are the players that I expect to be the most consistent when it comes to this Chargers wide receiver room. So they are the guys that I would want to have in my starting lineup. And I still like Quentin Johnston. I still think he can be flexible, especially if he has a good enough week 2 game. But I had him as a sit going into week 2. I think he should be rostered and all that. He can be a flex option, but it's going to be based on softer matchups. And I actually think going into week 3 that Ladd McConkey will suffer the most with Pat Surtain potentially on him, and then Keenan Allen will probably benefit the most, kind of like how we saw this past week with Michael Pittman and Josh Downs go. And maybe that does open up some things for QJ as well. So I do think he's low end, flexible, maybe kind of like Troy Franklin, who has the asterisk there. Maybe QJ should get one too, especially if he has a big week 2 performance. But for the most part, it's just tough to trust Quentin Johnston on a week-to-week basis. So we'll see how he looks in week 2. And ultimately, I still think that these Chargers wide receivers, all be maybe a little frustrating, are still going to be very good fantasy options on a week-to-week basis. Next up, we got the Saints traveling to face the Seahawks. And this Saints offense, I think, was pretty impressive in week 2 against a decent Niners defense, and Spencer Rattler came out 3 for 200 passing yards and 3 passing touchdowns. Can't ask for much more than that from what most people expect to be the worst quarterback in the league this year. And Rashid Shaheed had a touchdown and 15 fantasy points, and Olave had 11.4 fantasy points. So, we look at this matchup against the Seahawks. They have allowed the fewest fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. So that does concern me. And even with that, I still don't think I'm ready to call Olave or Shaheed anything more than a flex option. Still don't know really like the true ceiling with these guys with Rattler at quarterback. And this is a tough matchup. So I think they're perfectly fine to flex, but I'm not going to call them anything more than a flex here on the road in a tough matchup. Now, one of my favorite players going into week 2 was Jackson Smith-Njigba. He had 18.3 fantasy points, 10 targets, 8 catches, 103 receiving yards. So not as drastic as, the volume was in week 1, where he basically was like 85% of the offense. And we did see a little bit of involvement out of Cooper Kupp. So I got him in the flex category, going from a sit to a flex, kind of lower end flex, I still think, but this is a good matchup against a Saints defense that hasn't been fantastic through the first 2 weeks of the season, but has been a little bit better than you might expect. But still, I like Kupp this week as a low-end flex. I think it's just tough to read looking through the first 2 weeks of the season. But Sam Darnold, was much better in week 2, although he threw 2 interceptions, was much better in terms of overall passing yards and passing touchdowns. So JSN remains a must-start player every single week. You guys know I was really high on him in general going into the year. Good start this week. Kupp, flexible. It is worth noting Torrey Horton did find the end zone. Maybe a player to keep an eye on. A player that I liked a lot going into the season as well as a sleeper, and but still very, very low volume and was only on the field for 40% of snaps. So Horton, worth paying attention to, but not going to be a start anytime soon. Next up, we'll have the Cowboys traveling to face the Bears, and I'm expecting some points in this game, some fireworks. These are 2 bad defenses. These are 2 offenses that are in kind of weird spots right now. I like this matchup a lot for fantasy. You already know you're starting CeeDee Lamb, 18 or more fantasy points through the first 2 weeks of the season in each game. This is a smash spot. Jalen Johnson, the Bears starting corner, probably their best defensive player, definitely the best in the secondary. One of the best corners in the league is out this week with a groin injury, so this is very good news. Lamb is a smash start, and I think for that same reason, I'm going to move Pickens into the start area. He's still maybe in the flex just because he's a bit boomer bust. Don't always know what to expect on a week-to-week basis, but 17.8 fantasy points for him. I have a touchdown, which was encouraging to see. So if you own Pickens, I say fire him up this week. I really like this matchup against the Bears. And then when it comes to the Bears wide receivers, Rome Odunze looking like an absolute draft day steal. He had 31.8 fantasy points in week 2, 11 targets, 7 catches, 2 touchdowns. And we had Odunze as a start over DJ Moore as a flex option last week, and that's what the numbers are really representing here. So, Caleb Williams threw the ball 30 times this past week, 35 times in week 1. Despite some offensive woes here, it looks like Rome Odunze is going to be the biggest beneficiary out of this Bears wide receiver room in terms of fantasy points scored this year. So keep rolling with them. It's a good enough matchup against the Cowboys here. DJ Moore in the flex area, but I don't know what to make out of DJ Moore with just 5 receptions this past week, just 3 in week 1. Low ceiling play, but still startable in the flex due to the matchup. Let's hope he kind of gets it going here. And then in terms of like Olamide, Zacchaeus, or Luther Burden, there's nothing here from a fantasy perspective, but you got to feel great if you went with Rome Odunze in your drafts. He's going to be a locked and loaded must-start player until further notice. Last game of the afternoon slate, we're going to have the Cardinals traveling to face the 49ers. And Marvin Harrison Jr., this is just the story here. Like what do we do here? 18 fantasy points in week 1, has all the involvement that you want to see. Week 2, just 4.7 fantasy points. Something about this scheme on a week-to-week basis just does not play to the strengths of Marvin Harrison Jr., and it absolutely blows my mind. We saw Michael Wilson score a touchdown this past week. There's nobody else really, though, to talk about the wide receiver position. It should just blatantly be Marvin Harrison Jr., who had a very solid week 1. So I'm leaving him in the start category against the Niners this week. Maybe he's moved down a notch to like a low-end wide receiver 2 or flex for you, but I think you just got to roll with the punches here. And unfortunately, this offensive scheme is just doing the same exact thing it did last year. So it's not super encouraging, but I think he'll bounce back. this week, I hope. I mean, I think we'll see fluctuation like we saw last year, and hopefully he bounces back this week. Okay. Ricky Pearsall maybe should be moved down to the flex area or like a lower end start, but I'm just going to leave him in the start category. Once again, maybe I'm stubborn. Maybe I'm just a Ricky Pearsall fan. But we did see some injuries to the Cardinals secondary this past week against the Panthers. So they're kind of finishing pretty low, bottom 12 against the wide receiver position. And, you know, Mac Jones played very well at the quarterback position this past week, did throw 3 touchdowns, over 270 passing yards. So if he's the starting quarterback, Purdy continues to be out, then I think Pearsall will be just fine either way. But we did see Jawan Jennings have a big week this past week after not playing so well in week 1. 10 targets, 5 catches, 89 receiving yards, a touchdown, 19.9 fantasy points for him. So I think he's in the flex category as well and a startable player for you guys. Once again, maybe Pearsall you could consider to be a little bit lower here, but I think he's still going to be a solid enough start for you guys. But Jennings does have some nice upside. In terms of anybody else on this roster, Kendrick Bourne or whoever, MVS, they're going to be sits for me here in week 3. Moving along to Sunday Night Football, we're going to have the Chiefs traveling to face the Giants. And yeah, not exactly sure why this is the Sunday Night Football game this week, but it is. So let's start with the Chiefs side of things. The Giants have allowed the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers thus far on the season, playing the Commanders and the Cowboys. So I think this is a very solid spot for Hollywood Brown. I moved him down to the flex, but the more I think about it, you know, although he struggled week 2 against the Eagles, and what I thought would still be a good spot for him, I think he might be closer to a start this week because this is just such a good matchup. Sunday Night Football, although the Chiefs are on the road, all eyes are on them as they are 0-2. This is probably going to lead to a good game for Hollywood Brown due to the matchup as well. So really, there's nobody else at wide receiver here. You got Juju Smith-Schuster, Tyquan Thornton. Like, I know Thornton had the touchdown, but like he only had 2 catches in this game and like this past week. Like, I'm not considering him to be a fantasy factor yet. So Hollywood, I think a very solid flex this week. Comes to the Giants, this is actually a pretty good matchup. The Chiefs secondary has struggled this year, even though they had a good week against the Eagles wide receivers this past week. So you got to roll with Malik Neighbors coming off of a 37.7 fantasy day against Dallas in week 2, where he scored 2 touchdowns and had 167 receiving yards. And you're probably rolling with Neighbors anyway. So yeah, don't change your mind there. I know he only had 12 fantasy points in week 1, but even with that, he's finishing as the fantasy wide receiver 1, going into week 3. You got Randall Robinson had 28.2 fantasy points this past week, 11.5 in week 1, had a big touchdown, had 142 receiving yards against the Cowboys. Now, like I said, the Chiefs have struggled, but I don't think they're as bad as the Cowboys defense. And obviously they have a much better defensive coordinator and Spags and everything. So listen, I think both these guys are, Malik Neighbors is no doubt must start. Robinson is a strong flex, but don't be surprised if we get back to like the 11, 12 point PPR type mark for Robinson in week 3. But do you think he's a good flex? Should be picked up off the waiver wire, especially if Russell Wilson can give us more of what we saw in week 2 compared to what we saw in week 1 for the Giants passing attack. To wrap things up, one Monday Night Football game this week. We have the Lions traveling to face the Ravens. Amon-Ra St. Brown, 39.2 fantasy points in week 2, 3 touchdowns, 115 receiving yards, 9 catches off 11 targets. This is why you start a player like Amon-Ra St. Brown every single week and you don't panic. Similar to guys like Malik Neighbors, who we just talked about, or Jamar Chase, don't panic based off of 1 week. Amon-Ra St. Brown has to stay in your starting lineup. The Ravens have not been great against opposing wide receivers on the season so far, so this is a great spot for him. Jameson Williams came back to life in week 2. Just 2 catches, and really that first catch should have been a touchdown, it felt like, but he did score a touchdown luckily later in the game, had 108 receiving yards, 18.8 fantasy points. Still pretty low volume, just 4 targets, 2 catches, 5 targets, 4 catches in week 1. So, I mean, this is Jameson Williams. You shoot for the moon, boom or bust. strong flex option, but I do like him in a matchup that should be high scoring. Then we move to the Ravens, and Zay Flowers continues to be a start. Pretty safe floor is the important thing here, but we did see that ceiling in week 1, 28.1 fantasy points in week 1, 14.9 this past week. But what's interesting is Rashad Bateman is not really being utilized in this offense, nor is Mark Andrews. But this past week, DeAndre Hopkins had another touchdown, just 2 targets, 2 catches, similar to his stat line in week 1. Devontae Walker came out of nowhere with 2 receiving touchdowns. So the volume's still super low for Walker and Hopkins. Can't consider them in fantasy yet, but worth paying attention to them. Yeah, interesting to see Bateman kind of be pushed back in this wide receiver room, but I mean, he's still at 4 targets, so I don't really know. And then Andrews kind of being completely just not utilized in this offense. So the volume's there for Zay Flowers. Going to be fireworks in this game. Should be high scoring. He is a very solid start to wrap up our week 3 wide receivers. And there you guys have it. Every single wide receiver, every single matchup, every single game for week 3 of the fantasy season and who you should be starting or sitting. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. If you guys need anything whatsoever, moving into week 3 of the season, please drop me a comment. I'll answer as many as I can throughout the week. And while you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor if you guys hit that subscribe button on the way out. All we do here is free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. So if you're into that, be sure to subscribe on the way out. And when the videos, playlists pop up on the screen, check out all of our other week 3 videos for the week. We're going to have everything you could possibly need to dominate week 3 of the fantasy season and every single week of the fantasy year. So with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.